And item 3 is our session this afternoon. So I'd like to welcome the Minister and your officials to the meeting this afternoon. This is in regards to ministerial scrutiny, in regards to business support, in regards to the situation that we're currently in with our the COVID-19 pandemic. Minister, shall I ask your officials to introduce themselves, or would you like to introduce them?
That'd be great. If they could introduce themselves, we'll check that the sound systems are working as well.
Lovely. So if I come to you first, Emma.
Yes, Prynhawn da, good afternoon. I'm Emma Watkins. I'm Deputy Director for Economic Policy within the Welsh Government.
Simon.
Hi everyone, my name's Simon Jones. I'm the Director of Economic Infrastructure in Welsh Government.
Okay, can I just check that my sound was a little quiet there when you spoke? Can you just repeat that again, Simon?
Okay, good afternoon everyone. My name's Simon Jones. I'm the Director of Economic Infrastructure in Welsh Government.
Okay, I can hear okay, but it's a little quieter than normal. So I'll just ask the IT just to see if they can do anything with that. Senedd?
Prynhawn da, good afternoon. Senedd Evans, Director of Business and Regions in Welsh Government.
And Hugh.
And good afternoon. I'm Hugh Morris. I'm the Director for Skills, Higher Education and Lifelong Learning in Welsh Government.
Thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Minister, if I can ask, I don't expect a large, long answers to my initial questions because they're just very broad questions, but I wonder if you could perhaps give an overview of how you've managed to liaise with business and the unions and the wider workforce in developing your response to the crisis that we're currently in.
Well, thanks, Chair. I think we're fortunate in Wales in that we work in social partnership with employer organisations and with trade unions. We're also fortunate that we've got a system in place now within Welsh Government that has regional teams across the length and breadth of the country. During the course of this crisis, we've had fortnightly calls with trade unions. We've also had fortnightly calls with rail unions, very regular calls as well with employer groups, including activities such as business webinars and so forth. We have a social partnership council taking place this coming Thursday. And in addition to this, our chief regional officers and their teams have been actively engaged with businesses across their respective regions. So the level of dialogue, the level of communication generally, and the level of collaboration has been pretty unprecedented as far as I'm concerned. And indeed, it has to be said with local government and with UK government.
So you don't think that there's anything further you can do in terms of improving that liaison with the stakeholder groups? You're satisfied that the liaison has been the correct level?
I think it's been proportionate. I think it's resulted in some very positive outcomes, particularly in regard to the development of the Economic Resilience Fund. And I think it's something that we've been able to demonstrate to other governments has worked incredibly well. So I think this is, in terms of our dialogue and engagement with the other DAs and UK government, we've been able to flag up our social partnership approach and how beneficial that's been.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I wonder, you've announced a number of schemes and obviously there's finance attached to those schemes. I'm happy if your officials want to come in with some more detail on this, but I wonder if you could give an overview of where the funding has come from to fund the Welsh Government schemes that you have announced.
Sure, so there's something in the order of £1.7 billion being provided to businesses in Wales by the Welsh Government. £1.2 billion of that has come as a result of consequentials, and then a further £500 million that we've been able to, if you like, rake from across government departments. This is money for a fund that is in addition to what exists across the border.
Okay, and can I ask you as well how you're liaising with colleagues across the border in your Westminster government ministers? Is that a good relationship? Is there anything you can say in terms of your dialogue with them?
Well, we've never had as much dialogue as we have had in the past 7 weeks, not just with UK government, but also with the other DAs. I speak every week with the Secretary of State for Wales, and I have to say that the relationship that I have with him and with the Welsh office has been incredibly helpful. I have weekly calls with Nadeem Zahawi in Bays again. He's been incredibly responsive to our calls for amendments to UK government employment schemes and to some of the business support schemes as well. We have regular calls with Department for Transport ministers. The last took place just on Friday, in fact. I speak very regularly indeed as well with ministers across the DAs, and we have quadrilateral calls on a weekly basis as well. I speak regularly with the local authority lead members for transport, for economic development, and indeed the leaders as well. So I think that the level of dialogue has been exceptional. It has resulted in some positive changes to certain schemes. For example, the lifting of the cap from £25 million in regard to CBILS came as a result of our call. We're now making a very strong pitch for additional support to be offered through the job retention scheme. I'm hopeful that the UK government will respond well to that. We've made various representations on behalf of sectors as well, which are being considered by UK government. And in terms of our engagement with local authorities at a regional level, it's worked brilliantly. We're seeing an unprecedented degree of regional collaboration right now, not just between local authorities, but also between Welsh government and local authorities. I think the key thing, though, is that whilst our engagement has been pretty exceptional with local authorities, with DAs, with UK government, it's essential that we drive meaningful outcomes as a result of that. That sometimes hasn't happened, as you could probably predict, but by and large, I've been pretty satisfied with the way that I've been able to engage with my counterparts across the UK and with local authorities in Wales.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I should have said at the beginning to the officials that if you feel that you want to add to anything the Minister said or come in at any point, if you just raise your hand, then I will indicate back to note that I've seen you and then bring you in. Is there anything any officials or Simon Jones wanted to add? No. Okay, if no other members had indicated to come in at this point, no, then I'll move to the next set of questions, which is from Mohammed Ashkar.
On the panel there. My question is just regarding the changes needed to be addressed, any gaps in this during COVID-19, where the Minister, can you give any details of the specific type of support you intend to put into place in phase 2 of the COVID-19? I mean, Economic Resilience Fund, for which you have set aside for £100 million.
Yes, thanks, Mohammed. A paper is going to be submitted to my office this week, and we'll then be able to make an announcement regarding the further support that we're making available. I think it's worth saying that we've been able to take stock of some of the recent announcements by UK government in shaping some of the support that we're offering, particularly the announcement about the bounce back scheme. That is very important. It's essential that we consider how effective that has been as we look to what gaps we prioritise our funding with. I don't want to give any specific detail today because the announcement on the second phase is due over the course of the next week. So I think with respect, I think it may be best just to show a little patience right now because, as I say, it's vital that we take stock of those UK government schemes and the effectiveness of them.
Oh, thank you very much, Minister. Whether there any further support will be available for via the Development Bank of Wales, £100 million COVID-19 loan use fund fully subscribed within the first week of the operation. So how are you going to?
Yes. We're looking at further support subject to the appropriate clearances being given. Then we'd expect the Development Bank to be able to go on responding to business needs that relate to the coronavirus epidemic. But it's also worth adding that there are other existing funds that the Development Bank still have available to businesses, including those micro business loans, the startup loans, and so forth. And I should have said, actually, in terms of our engagement with colleagues across the UK, we've been able to point to Business Wales, to point to the Development Bank as bodies that are able to support businesses swiftly. So, for example, within the Development Bank, the pod model that's adopted for considering loan applications and then for administering them has been incredibly effective in making sure that we get the money out of the Development Bank as swiftly as possible. And as I said, I think it was just last week, pretty much all of that £100 million that was offered up has been allocated to the businesses that had applied for it, and virtually all of that money is now out of the door in the hands of businesses. That's supporting about 14,500 jobs that would possibly have otherwise been lost.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm very pleased with the job you're doing at the moment anyway, but the concern have been raised by tourism sector regarding the financial support for self-catering businesses and the different approaches being used by individual local authorities in locating the support. And also another area which I would like to add, Minister, is nobody mentioned yet, is the racing industry in Wales. It's nearly £4 billion worth, and I think we have to put something, because that's also attract a lot of Irish and English supporter and these horse race loving people to come and join our festivities in Wales. So how you're trying to help them out, please?
Well, in terms of the tourism sector as a whole, we're giving local authorities discretionary powers to be able to support certain businesses. We're arguing for an extension to the job retention scheme for certain sectors, including tourism, recognising that most businesses within the tourism sector are really going to struggle to generate enough revenue in 2020 to be able to continue with the sort of employment levels that they've enjoyed in recent years. I'm acutely aware of the difficulty that the racing industry is facing right now, because, as you're aware, Bangor-on-Dee Races is based in my own constituency, so I'm aware of the pressure that particular sector is under. But that's one of many sectors that I feel will be supported through an extension of the job retention scheme. Now, I think some evidence out there published recently suggests that in parts of the UK, including Scotland, for example, unemployment could hit 30% if there is a sudden removal of the job retention support scheme. So it's absolutely vital that we don't hit a cliff edge at the end of June, that scheme progresses into a second phase. I've written with my colleague Minister for Finance today to the Chancellor regarding the furlough scheme, and Chair, if I may, I'd happily share that letter with yourself and with members of the committee, because it highlights where we think that improvements could be made to the scheme and how it should be administered, how it should be supported moving beyond the end of June. We do recognise that this scheme has been a godsend for many businesses, and congratulate the Chancellor and his team in developing a scheme that has been so instrumental in keeping people with a degree of income that they would otherwise not have had. And so it's vitally important now that that scheme is not removed prematurely.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you, Minister. Can I just press you? I understand on phase two. I understand entirely that the reasons why you don't want to make any announcements today. That's understood. You mentioned you're going to get a paper from officials. Could you just give us some indication of a timeline? Are you expecting the announcement later this week, or when may that be?
It will. So the paper that goes through a number of processes. First of all, there's the options paper that's considered by a group of senior officials. That then results in what's called an MA, ministerial advice, formally being submitted to myself. That's going to be with me by the middle of this week, I believe, and then depending on my thoughts and considerations and the observations of some of my colleagues, we'll sign it off or ask for further tweaks to be made. I recognise that we need to get an announcement as soon as we possibly can, but we really do need to carefully consider this next phase, because having spent already around about £400 million of the Economic Resilience Fund, we're now reaching the point of the final 100 million. So we need to ensure that this final tranche of money that we know is available to us, we might be able to draw out more than maybe more through consequentials, but this final sum of money that's available to us is put to very best use. So I'll carefully consider it, but I'll do so in the swiftest possible way. So if I can get an announcement out by the end of this week, if it's based on my immediate approval, then that may be possible. But I don't want to rush to this, because, as I say, this is vitally important money. It's a finite resource, and we have to make sure that we get this second phase absolutely right.
Okay, well, thank you for explaining that timeline. That's helpful for us to know. I'll move on. Unless Helen really wanted to come in, I'll move to Vicky. No, that's fine. Vicky Howells.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for sparing the time to be with us today. I've got some questions around what additional government support is needed in the coming months. And of course, with the Prime Minister's statement last night, I'm sure there's plenty for us to get our teeth into there. So thinking about the next phase of the pandemic, and also for the longer term as well, what support can the Welsh Government provide to safeguard businesses and jobs in Wales?
Thanks, Vicky. I think it's worth stressing that some of our big strategic aims have not shifted because of coronavirus. We're still committed to decarbonisation, to fair work, to ensuring that we balance the economy across all of the regions, and indeed within the regions. In order to do that, and there is an opportunity as we recover from coronavirus to do just that, in order to do it, though, we have to make sure that some of our big stimulus packages, the infrastructure packages, for example, are used to drive fair growth and decarbonisation. But alongside our investment in infrastructure and the ongoing support that we'll be able to offer through Business Wales, through direct Welsh Government support through the Development Bank, there is, without a shadow of a doubt, a need for the job retention scheme to be prolonged, because that will make a decisive difference to the success or failure of certain sectors, including tourism. We've heard already the aviation sector as well requires ongoing support. So in addition to what we can do in Welsh Government, the UK Government's support schemes that are already operating really do need to be extended still further into the future.
And on that note, Minister, we took evidence last week from trade unions, and they were very firmly of the opinion that there needs to be designated approaches for particular sectors such as tourism, aviation, manufacturing, retail, as you've outlined there. What is your view on that, and do you see that kind of sectoral support coming from UK Government, Welsh Government, or a mixture of the two?
So our support to date has been pan Wales and pan sectors, but the UK Government support, we've asked for certain sector-specific support, principally for aviation, tourism, and also for the steel sector. The UK Government has by far the deepest pockets and therefore the greatest ability to intervene in order to support those sectors that are going to require a further period of hibernation or a greater degree of nursing into the future. So whilst we'll be able to make investments through the business and regions budget, that budget does not come anywhere near what is available to UK government ministers. And I think the IFS have only recently recommended that as a result of coronavirus, there should be more funding made available to the devolved administrations to support business development and to support the economy. And that was another factor that drove myself and Rebecca Evans to write to the Chancellor.
And aside from that letter, have you had any further discussions yet with the UK Government about the scale of additional funding that will be needed in the longer term?
Well, we don't know exactly what sort of scale of funding is going to be required in terms of business support, because it's going to depend in part on how long the furlough scheme can operate. If the furlough scheme is to be removed at the end of June, we may see unemployment rise to levels that we've not seen since the 1930s. and that would in turn require a massive economic stimulus package that would have to last many, many years, if not decades, in order to recover from this. If the furlough scheme can be extended still further after June the 30th, then the package of support for supporting the economy as a whole may well be actually less. So it's my view that the furlough scheme could actually be an investment today in order to save longer term.
And a final question from me with regard to, our real big hitters in the Welsh economy in this field. So I'm talking about Tata, Airbus, GE. Can you confirm to us that you are in discussions with them about the kind of sectoral support that will be needed for those areas?
Yeah, we most certainly are. We're in very regular communication, constant communication at an official level. The weekly calls with the Wales office and with Bays cover these sectors and those specific businesses that you've highlighted. We're also in direct communication with some of the HQs for those businesses, as you can imagine, and we're working with regional leaders and local authority leaders as well, because of course they're being approached by a number of those big employers.
Helen Mary.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, and also further opportunity to thank you for the way in which you've worked cross party with the lead spokespeople in this. It's been very helpful. Can I just give you an opportunity to put on record the approach that you have been taking specifically with the other governments in the UK around tourism? I think you've mentioned before that there is discussions ongoing at that level about a long-term package of support potentially for tourism and hospitality businesses, particularly those businesses that might lose their whole season this year at the way things are going. And can you confirm as well that you are asking the UK government to distribute any support that they may be giving, not on the basis of the Barnett formula, but on the basis of the significance of tourism to the economies of the different nations of the UK? So I think we're all very aware that tourism is a more important, more significant part of the Welsh economy than would be true, for example, of many regions of England.
Thank you, Helen Mary, and thanks for your kind comments. And I'd agree entirely that we've engaged very constructively over the course of the past few months over this crisis and how to respond to it. And you're absolutely right about the regular calls that have taken place across the nations regarding a common approach to supporting the tourism sector and the need for a prolonged period of support from UK government in order to hibernate a lot of those businesses that are not going to be able to generate revenue until at least the spring of 2021. And if public confidence does not return until after that point, then it may be even further into 2021 before significant revenues can be generated. I don't want to step on the toes of my colleague, the Deputy Minister for Culture, Sport and Tourism, but I do know that he has had a quadrilateral call in the last week concerning the approach that could be taken to support the tourism sector. It's our view that there has to be a prolonged period of support for tourism. And as you rightly point out, I wouldn't wish to see any funding for sectors that are particularly prominent in Wales to be Barnettised, because that would essentially leave us with less funding per active enterprise than we might expect on the basis of a proportion of businesses engaged in that particular sector. And there's a precedent for our call for this to be made, in that we said to Bays when we were offered a Barnet consequential of the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund that we would actually rather be part of the UK programme, but with one very, very strong caveat, which is that we would expect as an absolute bare minimum a Barnettised equivalent of funding for steel businesses in Wales, but that our expectation would be that those businesses in the steel sector would draw down a much larger proportion of the amount of money that was available through that fund. So I'd be quite keen to apply the same principles to support for other sectors that are particularly significant within the Welsh economy. We could include perhaps tourism in that. We could include perhaps the aerospace industry. The automotive industry as well is critically important. It supports tens of thousands of jobs across Wales. It's already facing a huge challenge in terms of the move from the internal combustion engine to electrification and changes to consumer behaviours. I think there's a call for the automotive sector to be treated with special attention as well.
Before I move to Heaven, David, Joyce Watson, did you have a question?
Yeah, just very quickly, Minister, good afternoon. One area that hasn't been mentioned at all is the oil industry. And of course in Milford Haven particularly, a negative impact on that for the jobs more locally will be felt harshly because there's an awful lot of supporting jobs around that. But the other side, of course, is the revenue that is paid to the Welsh Government at a time when we can ill afford to lose any revenue also. So what sort of discussions have you had with regard to the oil industry, particularly here in Milford Haven?
Well, this has been raised on numerous occasions, the point that you make about Milford Haven being very well made with UK government ministers. But in addition to that, the oil industry, as you can imagine, given the Scottish government's interest in it, is raised on a weekly basis during quadrilateral calls as well. I think it may be worth saying, it's just made me think actually, Chair, that as we emerge from this particular crisis, the role of the city and the growth deals are going to become even more important in supporting and not just the recovery, but long-term priorities in terms of decarbonisation and fair growth. And I think in particular in some of those parts of Wales that that are really feeling the consequences of coronavirus because they have certain sectors that are so badly affected, those growth and city deals are going to be critically important.
I think there has to be a significant change in terms of the growth deals that are and city deals that are already in place and are coming on stream, such as the North and Mid Wales. Is there going to have to be a significant reshape of some of the deals?
I'm not sure there'll need to be a significant reshaping of all or any of the deals, but I am aware that those regional leaders are paying very close attention to the projects, where they're project-based, and to what additional support could be given to certain projects that that have been left exposed by coronavirus. I know also that that on a cross-government basis, local government working with Welsh government basis, recovery plans are beginning to be formed in some of the regions. I'd like this work to be consistent across all of the regions. I'm encouraging those growth and city deal arrangements to really focus on how they can make growth and city deals, coronavirus recovery deals in the short term, but not losing track of the long-term objectives of each of the deals.
Yeah, I suppose there is a difference between some of the deals have already got projects that are established, and some of the deals haven't yet been even formulated as projects. So there's, I suppose, there's an issue of some of the deals moving at different stages.
Yeah.
Heaven, David.
The minister's asked for the UK government to publish a league table on high street bank lending. First of all, how is that going to be used, that data going to be used? But also, what other UK-wide indicators need to be reported at a Wales level?
Thanks, Heaven. I think that it's important that there is some sort of transparency around high street banks' administration of CBILS to ensure that they're all administering it in a fair and consistent way. We're hearing from businesses that that might not be the case now unless we have the data to justify anecdotal evidence, and we simply do not know whether that scheme is being administered properly, fairly and appropriately by all of the high street banks. So I'm still hopeful that that data will be available, and they will be available on a Welsh basis. We've asked for disaggregated data concerning CBILS. I'd like to know what data is available as well regarding Wales in terms of the bounce back scheme. I think that would be very helpful. Yes.
Just before you go on to other if data you might need, what do you do if you receive information that a high street bank isn't adequately supporting?
So I have a fortnightly call at the moment with the high street banks. I invite each of the banks to report on their performance, and I have to say, when they report back on how they are performing, it sounds very, very impressive, but it doesn't necessarily tally on all occasions with what employer organisations are telling us. And so if we had disaggregated data concerning CBILS, we'd then know exactly, and if there was a league table published for the banks, we would know exactly whether or not the performance that were being presented.
But what would you do? What would you do?
We'd challenge the banks directly, which we've done already, but we'd be able to be challenging them with actual hard data at our fingertips.
What does a challenge look like?
Well, it comes in the form of a discussion with the banks regarding their performance compared to others, recognising that they're in a competitive market. One of the benefits of having a league table in terms of CBILS would be that it would drive competitiveness within the high street banking industry as well.
Are there any sanctions that you deploy?
That we wouldn't be able to deploy sanctions, I don't think, against high street banks over the administration of a UK government scheme.
Okay.
And that's why really, I think the only way that we can ensure that this scheme is being operated in a fair way in Wales is by publishing the data and bringing a good degree of transparency to it.
Embarrass them into behaving themselves. Can I ask, are there other pieces of data that you need at a Wales-wide level in order to carry out your function?
I think the more data we can get at a Wales level, the better. In terms of CBILS, that's been particularly important. We continue to make that call for Wales data. We have already, I can tell members, sectoral and regional impacts of coronavirus, which have proven very helpful in shaping our interventions. But any sort of schemes, including the job retention scheme that can be broken down by regions and nations basis, is very valuable in terms of shaping our interventions. I'm not sure whether either Emma or Senedd have a view on what other specific schemes could be disaggregated in terms of the data.
I suppose the thing I would say about the data really is that what's particularly important for us, Minister, going back to the earlier points and to the committee and as a chair, is that having a better understanding of the impact of the interventions that we're making as a Welsh Government will absolutely be able to help us in shaping the direction of any support moving forward. So actually the bank data just provides us with another source of information to help us to build on the impact that we've made already with the support that we've given. So any data is good data in this situation, but it has proved really quite difficult to at the moment extrapolate the information just for Wales. But I do feel we're on the cusp of perhaps receiving some of that in order to help us even fine-tune our support even more.
The data regarding the job retention scheme is really interesting. That demonstrates, and other schemes for that matter, the data that's been made available to us on a Wales basis would show that Wales is more dependent on government interventions than Scotland, Northern Ireland or England. With regard to the job retention scheme, 74% of businesses have applied for that particular support stream. That's an incredible proportion of businesses. It compares to, I believe, around about 67% in England. So it does show the value in making sure that we get Welsh data. And it also shows why the JRS is just so important to the future of the economy.
Sorry, Charlotte wanted to just come back in, I think, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to come back in and say, in terms of the ERF, we had 9,500 applications in for that within a very short period of time, around about the figure of £210 million worth. That scheme opened in the middle of April, and already, just looking at the latest stats from this morning, as of this morning, 5,200 offers had been made to almost £70 million. So the speed at which we're able to support has been really, really quick and really, really responsive. And as the Minister pointed out, in terms of the next phase, understanding the impact that is having and how we can tailor, which is actually a very small amount of money potentially available compared to the UK government on this, is incredibly important. So the more data we can gather, and we are actively attempting to get hold of that data as much as possible to make sure that we've got a very rounded offer for businesses in Wales. Yeah.
Okay, and with that information, we would obviously like to scrutinise you and monitor the economic impact of the pandemic here in Wales. How are you going to report on the economic impact, and also how are you going to cover the effectiveness of the support schemes that you've deployed thus far?
Well, in terms of monitoring and checking the performance, the criteria is very important in terms of the ERF regarding job retention requirements. Also, we get regular, as I said just a few moments ago, regular sectoral and regional impacts that enable us to monitor how effective our systems have been, and indeed how successful the UK government support schemes have been as well.
And finally, I had a constituent who received £10,000 in the council tax,
yes.
The business tax grant. And one of the things that he said is that he noticed other small businesses around him in the community were receiving the money, but were still operating and were still trading. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily say that they don't need the money, but it does suggest that there's been a kind of blanket approach to distributing grant funding to different businesses. How can you be confident that money has gone where it's needed and that fraud will be prevented as money is being distributed in the business community?
I don't think we should allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good in terms of the immediate interventions that we've made. It was absolutely vital that we got as much support to businesses as soon as we possibly could do. The risk when you enter into a crisis of this type isn't in taking a good amount of time and then making carefully considered decisions. The risk is that you don't do enough fast enough, that your response is too small or too slow. And as a result of the immediate response by us and with UK government's funding by the UK government directly with the JRS, we've been able to avoid huge losses of jobs. But in terms of being able to ensure that we do target our resources as carefully as we can, we're making sure that that next round of ERF is carefully considered, and that's why I didn't want to rush into it without taking stock of how effective C-bills, how effective the bounce back loan scheme are, how effective JRS is across all sectors, whether there are businesses that are operating as normal that are also getting grants, as you've highlighted. And so that's, as I say, that's why it's really important that we take time to consider the next round of ERF. And in terms of fraud, our appetite to take risk has certainly increased. There's no doubt about that. And it had to. We're in a crisis. But we've done all we can to ensure that fraud, the risk of fraud, is minimised. And as I've said before, we've introduced certain criteria within the Economic Resilience Fund that has reduced risk to as low a level as possible. And if we find that fraud has been committed after an award has been made, we can guarantee that we will go back and ensure that that award is clawed back for the public purse. And then finally, Chair, many grants, tens of thousands of grants, including the £10,000 grant that have been referred to, are being administered by local authorities. And so some of the responsibility for avoiding fraud sits with local authorities. But as far as I can ascertain to date, local authorities have behaved incredibly well. Yes, they've got the money out to businesses very swiftly indeed, but they've also done it in a way that absolutely minimises the risk of fraud.
Oscar Ashgar, you wanted to come in, I think.
Very much, Chair. Minister, you just mentioned earlier that you get reports from the banks quarterly, and that's very impressive. You're absolutely right, because banks are getting this 10,000 grant straight to the business's bank account, and they know who is getting the money, and the businesses should be supported in these COVID-19 time. My question, very short one, is the people who started business within last 1 year, they are on the back burner. That is the problem. So some businesses and the companies who started businesses very late last year, after 5th April 2019, they are the one having a bit of a problem with the banks and the grants availability to those. So what you're going to do about that and discussing with the banks?
Forgive me, I'm not entirely sure what the question was fully alluding to. Sorry.
I think the question is about the grant funding made available to those businesses who can't produce a set of accounts.
Yes. Existing businesses, but the new one.
Sorry. Okay, and the risk of fraud. Well, yeah. With the ERF, the Economic Resilience Fund, any business that applies for support has to sign up to their details being published. If they get a grant, their details will be published. They'll be available to the public, and therefore they risk exposing themselves as frauds if they are indeed fraudulent. So as we work through the list of applications and awards, we're obviously making checks of our own, but once awards are made, the public will be able to scrutinise that list of businesses that have received.
I think the second part of Mohammed Ashar's question was about businesses that are recently established businesses not having access under the current Economic Resilience Fund, and whether phase 2 would address that or not.
Well, we're looking at whether the UK government schemes and any further schemes may be able to support this. We recognise that it is a problem, I can assure you, Oscar, and we may be in a position that we'll be able to pick up those. And it is a small number of businesses, there's not many, but we may well be able to be in a position where we can assist them through phase 2 of the ERF.
Thank you.
Okay, I certainly hope that is the case. I've got a number of constituents raising that very issue with me. Helen Mary Jones.
We need to think, obviously. Sorry, am I off mute?
No, yes. We can hear you.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I was getting odd messages up on my screen, the joys of remote meetings. Obviously, we need to proceed with great caution when it comes to people returning to work, but we also do want that to be possible. And obviously, in the context of last night's announcement by the Prime Minister that this work becomes perhaps more urgent. Can you tell us what, in your view, needs to be done in order to prepare businesses and workers for potential new working practices that will need to be adopted as lockdown eases?
Thank you. I think what's vitally important is crystal clear guidance is made available in a timely fashion to businesses. And we've been in discussion with BEIS regarding working safer practices and the guidance for certain workplaces. There are obviously differences between England and Wales insofar as the regulations are concerned. I think it put us in an advanced position compared to England in terms of the 2-metre rule, and it has consequently prepared many businesses for the recovery period. But for those businesses that have not been operating during the course of the crisis, the working places guidance is going to be vitally important, and that's something that I'll be considering with social partners at the Social Partnership Council this week. I want to make sure that unions and employer groups are all bought into the guidance that we publish for all workplaces.
Thank you, that's very helpful. My next question really builds out of that. I'm sure you'll hear from unions in that Partnership Council what we heard as a committee last week from Wales TUC and the other unions. And it was their view that in any workforce moving to exit lockdown, every employer should be required to undertake a COVID-19 risk assessment, and that that should be developed in consultation with unions and workers. I wonder if you've got a view on that.
So we'll be discussing this on Thursday. There is through the regulations that have already been published, there is a three-phased approach to dealing with any lack of adherence to the regulations. First and foremost, employees should engage with management, or if they're unionised, should engage through their union. And then secondly, it can be escalated to local authorities and to the HSE. And then thirdly, if it requires further action, then it can be elevated even further to the police. And I think in terms of how we ensure that risk that employees are exposed to is minimised, the guidance should be highly effective in ensuring that that happens across various work settings. But we are keen, in addition, to highlight good practice. Very recently, working practices at CAF in Newport were highlighted as exemplary. But equally, we will call out bad practice as well, and we're working with the Wales TUC and individual unions in addressing reports. And I have to say, Chair, the reports are relatively small compared to how many businesses we have of bad practice.
Thank you, Minister, and that's heartening to hear. And I think, you know, we probably all understand that most businesses are really trying to get this right, and they do need that clarity of guidance. But as you mentioned, there will be sometimes a need for implementation. And you've spoken a bit about how effectively the existing 2-metre rule has been implemented and how that's been monitored. But I'm sure you'd agree with me that as we have more workplaces going back, there's going to be a greater need for monitoring, and sadly that will mean that there's on some occasions a greater degree need to enforce those rules. Are you confident that those responsible for the enforcement, and I'm thinking particularly at local government level, will have the capacity to enforce effectively and hopefully to prevent businesses getting to the stage where there might need to be criminal reporting? And what discussions have you had with your colleague Minister for Local Government to see whether additional resources might be required for local authorities to enable them to undertake that enforcement work on all of our behalf?
Well, we've checked because I think this is a vitally important consideration as we move towards restarting parts of the economy that have been in hibernation. We've spoken with local authorities, and we've engaged with colleagues in the Housing and Local Government Department regarding capacity within local government to support enforcement. It appears that local authorities are able to manage things fine at this moment in time, but of course we'll be monitoring very closely the capacity that's available as we see more businesses return to more normal activities. I'll be raising this again at the Social Partnership Council, recognising that if we're going to have confidence in the guidance being adhered to and in being incorporated into working practices across the country, then we need to have confidence that the enforcement systems are going to be adequate as well, should there be a significant number of businesses that do not comply with that guidance. That'll be discussed on Thursday, but I can tell committee that to date it appears that local authority enforcement capacity has been adequate.
That's helpful, thank you.
Joyce Watts, did you want to come in at this point?
Thank you, Minister. When we know now that yesterday there was an announcement that people need to go back to work in England, but of course we've got some people who live in Wales who work in England and vice versa. So what considerations are you giving to clarify those messages to the people who live and work across borders is one point. The other point is, of course, testing and tracing. If people are going back to the workforce at a time, I assume, when the pandemic is levelling off locally, are you intending then, if you ease transition into work, that the workplace will be testing and tracing people so that we don't see a spike again. And my very final question is, we've all seen the panic buying, because some people have been working all along. We've all seen the panic buying that happened in the supermarkets primarily. Has there been any work done to evaluate whether shop workers are increased in number, affected disproportionately then as workers outside the health care sector as a consequence of their workplace?
That's a really interesting question. I would need to, I think it's worth investigating that, but I'd need to liaise with colleagues in different departments regarding that particular matter, principally officials, ministerial colleagues in health. But certainly I'll try to ascertain any figures that may be able to answer that last question. And in terms of cross-border issues, as you can imagine, I represent a border constituency, and so I've already been emailed by a number of people asking the very same question. But actually, it's very clear on both sides of the border which businesses can reopen and which businesses must remain closed. And the message about getting back to work actually has applied to those people that are employed in businesses that could operate until now, but where it was decided they should essentially go into a period of hibernation. I think what's happened is some people have got the impression that there's a whole raft of businesses that were not allowed to open during the course of the initial part of the crisis that will suddenly spring open now. That's not the case. The guidance, regulations, very, very clear indeed over which businesses can reopen, which cannot, and it's pretty much consistent on both sides of the border. That information is available through a frequently asked question section on the Business Wales website, and it's available on the .gov.wales website as well. But there will be some businesses where there are differences. For example, we've heard that certain leisure activities may resume in the middle of this week within England that may not resume within Wales, and those leisure activities will also have jobs attached to them. For example, tennis clubs as one example. And so there may well be a small number of people who live within Wales but are employed in those leisure facilities just across the border that will be asking the question, do I need to go into work now? And for that reason, we are looking at how we can provide that very clear guidance through the Business Wales website, which is, by and large, it's already there. And I'd urge everybody to point any business that is concerned about this and any individual to the Business Wales online service.
Thank you. Back to you, Helen Mary Jones.
And this is a different set of questions around apprenticeships and trainee programmes.
Yeah.
Can I begin by asking whether you've been able to make an assessment of the number of apprentices that may have been made redundant or furloughed during this period, and what's being done to ensure that they're able to complete their apprenticeships?
I don't know whether Hugh Morris has a number. I don't believe we have that figure as of yet, because providers are obliged to ensure that apprentices complete their frameworks. They're also required to use their best endeavours to ensure that alternative work, an alternative employer is secured. We stepped in immediately to provide some surety to apprenticeship providers, to training providers, right at the start of this crisis. And as a result of that, we've been able to maintain as best as possible a training provision for apprentices during a really, really challenging period. I don't know whether there's anything more that Hugh would like to offer on this point.
And no, just to confirm what you've said, Minister, we don't have firm figures at this point, but there is an obligation on providers to provide alternatives where apprentices are displaced.
Thank you. So sort of further to that, Minister, you mentioned the initial support, the arrangements you came to. Can you tell us a bit more about the details of the funding arrangements that were made with work-based learning contractors and the impact that that will have on their provision and their staff?
Yeah, sure. This was support based on an average of funding over a period of time. I think she'll be able to give details about the specific figures, but our objective has been to ensure that we can avoid job losses as much as possible. Where furlough takes place, then so be it, but we wish to see a very minimum increase in unemployment, and so that's why we ensured that there was funding available to providers to guarantee that further funding, to guarantee that further activity, and to prevent the loss of jobs. Hugh, are you able to give an outline of the support, how the support was reached?
Well, just to confirm again some of the things you've said, Minister, the payment was based on the average of payments between August of 2019 and March of 2020. The funding is there to maintain the provision. We fully anticipate there'll be a greater demand for work-based learning support going into the autumn because of the need for people to either retrain for slightly different roles in their current employers or to retrain for other roles with other employers.
Thank you. And you'll be aware, Minister, and obviously Hugh Morris will be, that there's been some concern about the impact on these funding arrangements on the 100 or so really small subcontractors. That's a concern that some of that, I'm not clear in my own mind what the expectation is with regard to funding being passed on from the main contractors to subcontractors. So I wonder if you've made any assessment about that, or whether there were expectations with regards to that pass on from yourselves.
Yeah, I can confirm that we require providers to pay their subcontractors in the very same way that that they've received payment from the Welsh Government.
Good, and if that wasn't happening, you would wish to be made aware of that, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought that would be the case. And a couple of slightly more specific questions. Almost a quarter of apprenticeship programmes are in health and social care, and some of these are very young people aged 17 to 19. What steps have you made to ensure that these apprenticeships are kept safe? And I'm thinking particularly about the provision of protective equipment, and particularly for those perhaps doing placements in care homes.
Well, apprentices are classed as employees, and therefore they're protected by law. Going back to the mid-1970s, and that includes protection for their health as well and their well-being. So that would cover the provision of PPE, but I do recognise, the PPE demand is pretty intense, but that's not to say that any different approach should be taken to supporting apprentices with protective equipment than would be taken with ordinary employees. Those apprentices must be treated in exactly the same way.
Thank you, Minister. And to look at traineeships now for young people aged 16 to 18, and of course some of those, well, many of those will be young people who we might otherwise risk of losing from employment, education and training. This is obviously a difficult time in terms of staying in contact with those young people. What specific support is being offered to this group, and what steps are being made to ensure that we don't lose them at this very difficult time?
So there's online support that's being offered and online learning that's being offered to apprentices and learners who are going through traineeships. They've also people who have taken up traineeship opportunities are also still getting their training allowance. I don't know whether the committee has been offered yet the COVID continuity plan that's been developed by work-based learning providers and FEIs. What I'll do then, if I may, is perhaps arrange for that continuity plan to be shared with you. I think it'd be worth you scrutinising it.
That'd be really useful. And just finally on this area for me, obviously I think we can expect there to be considerably increased demand for employability support programmes, both during this emergency and as we come out of it. Can you tell us a bit about how provision is being delivered now and what plans there are to upscale that support if, as unfortunately, we may face significant redundancies as the next phase of the crisis proceeds?
Well, you're absolutely right. There could be immense demand for support. We've got very well established interventions, including Jobs Growth Wales, shared apprenticeships. We've got the Wales Union Learning Fund as well, which is being shaped to provide online learning and skills training for workers. We've got the Working Wales service as well, which is acting as a single point of contact for individuals. And we've also got Communities for Work, which is ready to be ramped up, and we've got REACT, of course. So all of these interventions that are tried and tested are ready to go. Any additional funding that would be required to increase provision would have to be secured from central finance, and we'd clearly be making an approach to colleagues for that funding at the earliest possible stage. But in order to reach the point where we would have overwhelming demand, we need to have surety about the job retention scheme. I keep going back to the scheme, but it is just so important to the economy. It is so important to Welsh workers that if it was to be withdrawn at the end of June, if we were to be thrown over that cliff edge, then we would be facing the prospect of up to 1 in 3 people in Wales being unemployed. And that is something that none of us have ever witnessed. Even in the worst of times, in the most challenged communities, we have not witnessed that sort of rate of unemployment. And so it's vitally important the job retention scheme is continued. I'm hopeful, I'm very hopeful that it will be. I applauded the Chancellor when he announced that scheme. He was absolutely right, and I'm hopeful that he's going to do the right thing and extend it further.
That's really positive to hear, Minister. And just sort of finally, is there likely, do you think, as he makes a fresh announcement about this, to be anything that we can be hopeful about for some of those people who were lost in the first tranche, some of the people who were changing jobs, starting new jobs at the time, particularly important for our tourism industry, seasonal workers? I mean, obviously it's not in your gift, but I'm just interested to hear, I know you've been having those conversations and what the sort of tone of those conversations are being, and whether you are optimistic for that group of people as well as for a potential extension beyond the end of June.
We've done everything we can to convey the concerns that have been expressed to us by yourself, by other members of the committee, by individuals who have been affected by this, by economic analysts as well. Repeatedly, we flagged up the need to address those gaps that emerged after the first announcement, and the need to make sure that a second phase of the job retention scheme is based on the lessons learned from the first phase, just as the C-Bills revisions were based on early lessons learned. So we've made the case as strongly as we possibly can. I do believe that it's been recognised by BEIS colleagues, and it's now for the UK Treasury to then determine whether to apply those lessons that have been learned and whether to make the necessary changes to the scheme as it enters a second phase. I sincerely hope they do that.
Okay, thank you, Helen Mary. Mohammed Ashkar.
Chair, my question relating to Cardiff Airport and some of aviation industry. Minister, there are some implication of funding, long-term and short-term assistance to Cardiff Airport, which you are kindly doing it and making it floating the airport rather than going under for a long time. So what are the plan in the short term during the COVID-19 and the long term, how you're going to deal with it? And you're also asked a bit, because aviation is not devolved. So you have asked the British government to change the policies regarding aviation urgently. So which area you would like to see changes? So my couple of questions in one rather than ask you so many
So, you know, Mohammed, the aviation sector is perhaps in the deepest crisis it has ever experienced. This is, in all probability, going to be worse than the fallout from 9/11 was. We've already seen BA announce 12,000 redundancies. We've heard how difficult other carriers such as Virgin and Ryanair are finding this period. No part of the sector anywhere on the planet is immune from coronavirus and its effects right now, and Cardiff Airport, of course, is no different. In terms of interventions that need to be made in the short and the long term, first of all, we need an aviation strategy from the UK government that recognises the value of regional airports, that recognises that in hopefully the not too distant future, there will be a recovery in the aviation sector, but that between now and that point of the recovery beginning, a very strong bridge has to be created to support as many people as possible who are employed in the sector get through this challenging period. In terms of some of the specific policy areas that we would wish to be considered urgently, which would help in the long term, I've highlighted previously the need to support our call for more public service obligation routes. We've been asking for 2 years for that to happen. In that time, the answer has been no, but we've seen certainly at least one, I think it was Newquay to London PSO route be created. So it's clear that the UK government is not refusing to create any PSO routes. So we would wish to see PSO routes to and from Cardiff Airport be created. The second concerns, and again, this is something that, my goodness, we've spoken about on numerous occasions, it's air passenger duty. And then the third concerns the competitiveness of smaller airports, and in particular, the disproportionate cost of security at smaller airports. It can account for as much as possibly sometimes even more than 30% of operating costs. That's a huge fixed overhead that many small regional airports in the UK are going to struggle to meet as we emerge from coronavirus. And whereas Cardiff Airport went into the crisis in a strong position compared to many other small regional airports, it has nonetheless faced an incredibly difficult task in ensuring that it can emerge in a strong position. And quite frankly, it will require support from UK government, not just direct support in terms of the costs, those overhead costs that I've referred to, and a potential package of support for the aviation sector as a whole to ensure that we get carriers based out of Cardiff, that we get carriers flying in and out of Cardiff, but also that those regulatory changes are made to guarantee the long-term viability of the airport. So there are huge, huge challenges for the UK. I'm completely aware of the challenges that UK government face in regard to aviation, but the success of the UK government for our part will be judged by how beneficial the impact of any interventions are for Cardiff Airport. In the meantime, in the short term, we've reprofiled the loan that was offered to Cardiff Airport to help in the short term. I don't know whether Simon Jones would like to talk a little more about that particular assistance that we've been able to offer the airport, but I have to stress again that the long-term viability of the airport now is dependent on the interventions by UK government, and it's absolutely vital that those policy changes that I've highlighted are considered with speed, because they will determine the long-term success of the airport.
Thank you very much, Minister. But the fact, my question regarding this COVID-19 period and my concern, and I'm very glad you have given me brief in your statement, but the problem is the aviation industry is threatened by 1,400 jobs in Nantigro, my region.
Yes.
There's a good quality, high skilled jobs are involved. What Welsh government is doing to expand program to support such businesses? How can we boost the training to make sure that we have the key skilled workers in the high-tech sectors in economy we will need in future? We should not lose them, Minister.
You're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. You know, whether it's GE or Airbus,
Yes.
These businesses within the aero sector are incredibly important, not just in terms of employing large numbers of people, but also in supporting the GVA of the economy. If you tore out the aviation sector, the aero sector from the Welsh economy, you would leave the GVA of our nation really much diminished. So it's vitally important that support is continued and maintained. Now, if you look at the history of support from Welsh governments, the likes of GE and Airbus, I think you'll find that there's a very proud story that can be told in terms of support for facilities directly, but also for the people that are employed there, particularly in regard to skills development. A huge amount of money has been invested in the people that are employed at these sites. And I want to make sure that we continue doing that. We're only going to be able to continue doing that if they still exist in Wales. And they're only going to continue to exist in Wales if we get a really serious, prolonged period of support from UK government in the form of the job retention scheme and in the form of sector-specific support packages.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Shall I just bring Simon Jones in? I think there was a point on the Cardiff Airport on the reorganisation of a loan, I think, that the Minister referred to.
Yes, so the Minister described the reprofiling of the loan that was made public before, and I think the committee has taken evidence on that loan previously. That loan was due to be drawn down over a period of 18 months, with a kind of a chunk of it later in this financial year. What we've allowed the airport to do is draw down that allowance for this year earlier than originally intended, which gives the airport the breathing space to get over the summer months. But we shouldn't underestimate the challenge that the airport have. The press have reported a lot on this. In other sectors, the airport, in common with many regional airports, makes its money over the summer months in order to be able to get funding for the winter months. It's effectively will effectively have lost a year's worth of revenue. So it's really, really challenging. Cardiff Airport is not alone in this. All other airports are going to be feeling the same pinch, particularly regional airports. The Minister identified three interventions that he's been pushing the UK government on. In addition to that, of course, there's a fourth which we're looking at as well and asking them to help with, and that's a kind of general state aid clearance. Provide additional support to the kind of a generic state aid clearance to provide support on top of the PSO and safety and security burden and the APD.
What's PSO again?
Sorry, public service obligation. So this is where an authority would contract with a supplier to provide services. So, essentially, that's what we have in the railways. That's what the franchises are, and increasingly we see that in the bus sector as well. And with the loss of Flybe, actually, it's going to be quite difficult for all regional airports in the UK to attract air carriers, because there isn't an existing air carrier that fills the market that Flybe. So it's really important for us to be able to contract with somebody, even if it's only in the short term, to be able to provide those vital links from Cardiff to places like Glasgow, Edinburgh, Belfast, and some of the other destinations that were served by Flybe, rather than waiting for the markets to be able to provide that, because we could be waiting 3 or 4 years. And it's a really important lifeline for businesses in the region. And without that, it makes it, it's not just about the airport. This is about the recovery of the region and the economy of the region.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, in that case, new set of questions from Heaven, David.
No,
I'd like
Joyce. I thought.
Oh, sorry. I think Joyce may have. Sorry, Heaven. I think Joyce may have addressed the question earlier on, but Joyce, have you or not?
On ports, no, I asked about oil, but I didn't ask about ports. And there's, there are two types of ports. One is air, one is sea. Yeah. I want to talk about seaports and any discussions that you've had with the UK government on support for the Holyhead to Dublin route, but also all the other ports that occupy the space that I cover.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I've not just held discussions with UK government regarding support for ferry routes and ports. I've also discussed this matter with counterparts in the other devolved administrations, and indeed with the minister responsible for this area of government activity in the Republic of Ireland. Now, with specific regard to the Holyhead to Dublin route, I spoke just last Friday, actually, with the Minister in the Department of Transport about this particular concern that I have. DFT are reluctant to intervene before the point of failure. Now, I accept that intervention has to come at the right time, but equally, I've made the point on numerous occasions now that we can't wait for an operator to fall over before interventions are made to support a particular route, and therefore constant monitoring and really careful attention will have to be paid to this particular route. It's a really fragile position that the operators are in, and they're losing money on a weekly basis. The point of failure could come at any given point, and it's vitally important that the UK government is ready before they fall over to invest in supporting that particular route.
Simon Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add to that, and I'm sure the committee will be well aware of this, but ferry operators rely on passenger traffic for a significant chunk of their revenue, and obviously that has disappeared. So that's what's causing the problem for the ferry operators, is not the lack of freight movement, the lack of passenger traffic. Yeah. That's likely to be that way for some time. So they do find themselves in difficult circumstances. One of the challenges that we've raised with the UK government is that particularly Holyhead, there are multiple operators who are providing services. The competition regulations at the moment prohibit those two operators from working together to perhaps produce a more streamlined timetable, which would allow them both to reduce their cost base whilst potentially providing an adequate level of service. So one of the things that ministers have asked UK government to consider is, not necessarily pouring money in, but is there a relaxation of some of the competition regulations on a very temporary basis to allow the operators to sort some of this out between themselves?
Okay.
I think it's probably what. Sorry, I was just going to say, it's probably what. I know we don't want to discuss Brexit today. We've got enough on our hands with coronavirus, but the future of our seaports and airports are incredibly important in terms of delivering against the UK government's desire to see the UK become a country that exports more post Brexit. And if we start losing regional airports, if we lose seaports, then that task of increasing exports is only going to become more difficult.
Thank you. Thank you, Oscar, for the prompt, and sorry to interrupt you, Evan David.
Okay, no problem. I'd like to ask the Minister about the short and long-term implications for bus, rail and community transport.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, just go ahead and if you can just tell us what you think the implications are to start with.
Potentially enormous. We're really worried about public transport, not least because behavioural change could see a reduction in patronage on bus services and rail sometime as people fear being in close proximity to other human beings. Secondly, during the course of the recovery, we're likely to see social distancing maintained, and that has capacity issues for the rail network and for bus services as well. We may see only 10 to 15% of capacity delivered on bus and rail services as social distancing maintains a 2-metre barrier between individuals. That then has a major impact in terms of the the subsidy that may be necessary to keep buses and to keep trains operating. And then the third point that's causing me concern in this regard is that there's a huge social justice issue that we need to consider, in that 20% of people in Wales just don't own a car. They do not have the option of driving to and from work, to and from hospitals and so forth. So there's a really important point to consider, which is how do we prioritise capacity in the coming months to ensure that those who are most dependent on bus and rail services, who are critical to the health and well-being of the nation, are able to actually access those services.
One of the things the Prime Minister said in his broadcast last night was to people, if you can use a car to get to work, then use your car, don't use public transport. How comfortable are you with that message for England? That wouldn't transfer over to Wales, would it?
So I am not going to say avoid public transport. I don't want people to fear using public transport, because actually with transport best practice in place in terms of making sure that good hygiene is available to drivers, in ensuring that people are social distancing, actually so public transport is relatively safe. And I wouldn't wish to say to the travelling public, avoid public transport. We're going to need more people to use public transport more of the time in order to get the sort of modal shift that our environment requires. Equally, I don't want to put at risk huge amounts of energy that has gone into already creating a system by which we're right on the cusp of being able to develop an integrated transport system in Wales. And I don't want to see that destroyed because people are discouraged from using public transport. In the longer term, we absolutely need more people to be going from A to B by public transport. And I'm not going to dissuade people from using buses or trains now. But what I would say is that we are going to have to plan better to ensure that that vastly reduced capacity is put to the use that meets our health and well-being priorities, but that also ensures that we deal with the potential social injustice that are highlighted, and that we prepare appropriately, that we make sure that trains, that buses, that stations are ready to accommodate the sort of numbers of people that may require lengthy queues, and that then we prioritise in the right way, because there's going to be a huge issue to consider around demand management. Who do we allow onto trains and onto buses if we have to choose between types of passengers? And how do we go about making sure that that prioritisation is delivered in a very transparent way? And this is something that I've spoken with my colleagues across the UK about. I spoke with Metro Mayors Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham last week about this issue, because of course it's going to be a real challenge within intensely urbanised areas where the demand for public transport is higher. And I have to say that we really do need some further detail insofar as availability of PPE is concerned, and testing and whatever else may be demanded from the sector, before we can implement any sort of significant increase in public transport services.
So before I'm sure we'll get the chance to look further ahead after the 28th of May as well. But for now, do you feel that the operators of public transport and local authorities that support them have responded effectively?
Local authorities have responded brilliantly through this crisis, and for the most part, operators have as well. I know that there are some that we've heard stories about concerning the availability of hand sanitizer and other hygiene products. But for the most part, operators have behaved very well indeed and responded very well. And those that have fallen short, we've dealt with.
Okay, and with regard to the money that you've provided for public transport, the UK government promised £167 million of new funding for English bus services. You've announced £29 million in Wales, and how much of that is additional funding that wouldn't have otherwise been provided? Okay,
so that additional money that was announced by UK government essentially only brought up the offer to English bus operators, only brought the offer up to what we were already offering in Wales.
Right, okay.
And that's because in Wales, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, about 45% of the income for bus operators comes from your purse, the public purse. Whereas in England, I think the figure is around about 25%, much lower. And therefore, our intervention was already significantly higher than in England. That additional money that was announced by UK government brought the subsidy up to Welsh levels.
So the 29 million you announced is additional money because of the crisis?
It's a hardship fund that was designed just to basically stem the bleeding, but Simon can explain the rationale behind that.
So in normal circumstances, bus operators claim reimbursement for carriage of mandatory concessionary fare passengers. They claim the bus services support grant, and they claim youth concessionary travel as well. And those are on a kind of per journey or per kilometre basis. With the crisis, the volumes of people weren't going to generate any money, any revenue for the operators as a result of those three grant provisions. So what the minister's done is allocated money to the operators from the budgets that we had for those three measures, pro-rated at the same rate as the operators were receiving those sums of money before. So, for example, if in the previous quarter an operator had received £500,000 for mandatory concessionary fare, BSSG, and the youth card, then they would have got that same amount of money in this quarter.
Okay. And with regard to rail services, I'm sorry I'm moving on, but time is so short. With regard to rail services, there's £40 million has been announced at TFW. How is that being allocated, and what is it going to be used for?
On the basis of pain sharing, so you'll be aware that revenue support systems that were incorporated into the franchise agreement allowed 20% of the pain to be placed on the shoulders of the Welsh Government, and 80% would be with the operator and development partner. We're looking at bringing the arrangements in line with DFT arrangements after June. Simon?
I just
the other way round.
Yes.
It was the other way around. I said 20% on our shoulders, did I?
Yeah. So
I wish.
Yes. So we would take a share of the gain in the good times, but in the bad times we also take a share of the pain. So we take 80% of the revenue shortfall, and the operator takes 20%. And clearly that's from a public funding perspective, that's useful in the short term, but it's not sustainable for very long, because that the operator can't sustain that level of losses. So we are looking to quite quickly move from the current arrangement to replicate in large part the same mechanism that's in place in England and Scotland, the so-called emergency management agreement, where the state is taking all of the revenue risk for operation of the of rail franchises.
Okay. Chair, would you mind if I just go on to PPE for taxi?
Go, that's fine.
Yep.
No, absolutely, Evan, yeah.
I did want to ask one question, which I've had from a number of different people. They use taxis to get to their only means of transport is taxis. Vulnerable people. How are those being supported, and what kind of advice are they being given with regard to the likes of PPE? And then how are private hire and taxi supported financially as well?
Okay, so those businesses, if they are eligible, are able to draw down support through the ERF, through the various UK government schemes. There may be some that are falling through the gaps. If they are, then we'd wish to hear about them as we consider the future of the ERF. But in terms of the travelling public, guidance will be published, not just for operators, but also for passengers as well. And we hope to publish that as soon as possible.
So have they had guidance with regard to safety and how to operate at this time?
So in terms of the guidance that they've had to date, they've had the regulations which concern the 2-metre rule. They've also had indications from UK government regarding how they should go about being carried in a taxi. The difficulty, of course, is that if you require a carer, you can't actually comply with those sets of guidance that are in place, which suggest that you should sit in the back left seat and you should only be in that vehicle by yourself. So there is an exception there in terms of people who require carers, and we acknowledge that that puts them in a very, very difficult position.
Okay, I think that's sufficient for now.
Joyce Watson, do you want to pick up any other further points? No. Perhaps I could ask just a little bit more on in terms of the transport network and in terms of being safe for commuters and for staff as well. Do you think there are sufficient resources available? You talked a bit earlier in an earlier response to ensure that you're ready for to be best place for people to use public transport. What level of resources are needed to get to that point?
In terms of protective equipment, or in terms of financial resource?
I was thinking of financial resource, but
financial resource.
Cover
okay.
Both. Yeah.
Well, in terms of financial resource, we don't know exactly what will be required yet, but you can base an anticipated requirement on what we're currently spending. So that anticipated spend is £250 million for a short period indeed of 6 months. That's a pretty sizable sum of money, but we need that certainty from UK government that further funding will be available so that operators have the confidence to continue in operation. In terms,
PPE and testing capacity as well, yes.
So in terms of, we don't know yet the full detail of what is proposed in terms of specific face masks. We've heard about face coverings, but in terms of the capacity that's going to be required and the availability to meet demand, we've raised this regularly, and I say we, meaning myself and my colleagues in the other DAs with UK government. We're very, very concerned that if there's a significant increase in the number of passengers on public transport requiring face masks and gloves, that could put the provision of such items for the NHS and care home settings at risk. And we're yet to get confirmation that there will be sufficient availability, that the capacity will be there.
How does that rub against your earlier answer in terms of perhaps not being so minded to encourage people not to use public transport and to use perhaps the cars, their own cars, or other means of transport? How does that rub against that? Because surely you would want to encourage you to use a public transport until those measures are
That's
in
right,
place.
Absolutely. And that's why I think timing is very important as well. That we wish to ensure that people can use public transport, but we wish to ensure that they can use it in the safest possible way. And we need to have answers to those outstanding questions regarding PPE and so forth before we hit go on the resumption of services.
And when do you think that might be in terms of timing?
Well, you'll have, I'm sure, seen numerous reports regarding the timing of increased rail services and bus services. My point to the DFT has been, don't set a date until you absolutely know that you have the drivers available to be able to increase services, that you have PPE for staff, that you know that the travelling public will be able to acquire or make facial coverings if that's what's going to be required. Don't set a date in time and then say we will work towards that and we'll commit to that regardless of whether public transport can operate safely. It's absolutely vital that public health is put first, but equally, I would not discourage, once we've reached that safe point of commencement for more services, I would not discourage the public from using public transport.
Minister, I think it was a couple of weeks ago approximately, you made a statement to members in terms of long-term mechanisms to fund public transport. Yeah. When do you believe you'll be in a position to report back on that?
Okay, so that's policy in development. I don't know whether Simon's kind of got an indication of when specifically we'll be able to report back to committee on that work. But I will endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible.
Yeah, if Simon can add to this, is the timing and the process as well.
So we're working through that at the moment in light of the limited assembly time for or plenary time for the buses bill as well. So that there's some decisions to be made there, because the buses bill was clearly a significant part of what the future looked like. So we're looking as well as the buses bill at contingencies should we not be able to get that through because of limited time. So there's a range of different activities which we're pulling together. I think it's going to take us several months to pull this together. So we are going to need to continue to evolve the short-term support that have been provided to buses in the same way as we're evolving the support to rail in the way the Minister has just described. So the package of support that's in place for buses runs through until the end of June. We're already talking to the operators about finessing some of the detail of the monthly reimbursement that each operator receives over the course of the months between now and the end of June. And I guess if ministers determine that there's a requirement to put additional support into buses post June, we will continue to refine those measures in parallel with developing a clear plan for what we do with support for public transport in the longer term.
I should just clarify as well, Chair, if I may, that that estimated figure that I gave of £250 million a year for public transport, if social distancing is kept for some time, reducing the fare box, would be in addition, that's annually, in addition to what we're already putting into public transport as a subsidy.
Okay, thank you. I think the final question from me. Your colleague, the Deputy Minister, made a statement the back end of last week in regards to sustainable transport measures in regards to COVID-19. There wasn't any financial assessment attached to that statement. Can you talk us through any, in terms of any financial element that's needed to resource what was announced at the back end of last week?
Sure. So the first thing we want to do is just get an impression from colleagues in local authorities what the appetite is for carrying out some of the work that Lee Waters gave detail to in that written statement. Once we know exactly the level of activity that could be delivered by local authorities, what that level is, we'll then be able to go to finance colleagues to be able to indeed look within our own budgets, if we can accommodate it from within our own budgets, the actual sum total of what that work requires. But at this stage, I think the best thing to do, as Lee Waters has done, is to actually go out to local government and ask, what is it in this period you could do, you would be willing to do, and you would want to do, and you'd have the support of communities to do, in terms of being able to reallocate road space, in terms of being able to improve and increase the provision of active travel infrastructure.
Yeah, and I understand that the UK government responsible for England and the Scottish government have already allocated funding resources. So given your response that you're going to go out to local authorities first, when do you expect to be in a position to make a decision on the funding that needs to be attached to that?
I'd need to check with the Deputy Minister as to when he's expecting responses back from all local authorities. But once we've had those responses back, we'll be able to run through them and estimate how much it cost.
Simon?
Responses from local authorities by the 21st of May. And the aim would be to turn that around really quickly, because there's a very limited window of opportunity for authorities to be able to do things. So in terms of the process will be quite quick once we receive the bids in from the local authorities.
Yeah, no, that was the basis of my question. So no, thank you, Simon. I appreciate there's a time scale here. Are there any other members that have got any other questions that need to be asked? We are over time. We're over time, so no quick fire questions. Oscar, then Joyce.
Thank you very much. As a Minister, I think you have a huge responsibility to get recovery on its way after COVID-19. Have you dealt, because we are agriculture country, so my point is, have any negotiation with our farming and community, that how quickly you can put them on the track to make sure there's an £8 billion industry that is to recover our economy in that sector.
Hold fire a minute, Minister. Joyce, do you want to come in with your question as well?
Yes, one final question. Small bus operators that rely very heavily on school transport and the implications for them, and what conversations and actions you've had.
Minister.
Thank you. In terms of agriculture, this is a responsibility, of course, of Leslie Griffiths, but we're working very closely because there are interdependencies between agriculture and other sectors of the economy. I've spoken with the president of one of the major farming unions regarding opportunities for the recovery period. And in terms of small bus operators working with local authorities on school transport provision, Joyce, officials have, I believe it's currently twice weekly, calls with the Confederation Passenger Transport and with bus operators. They discuss these issues on a very, very regular basis indeed. So they are alive to all of the concerns regarding the provision for learners and what might be required in order to support SMEs as we resume school attendance in the months to come.
Simon.
Just to add to what the Minister was saying, Minister and the Chair of the Welsh Local Government Association wrote to local authorities weeks or so ago now. Local authorities are guaranteeing 75% of the revenues to those exact same kind of operators that Joyce Watson was referring to, who do school transport and Section 63 services for local authorities.
Okay, thank you, Simon. That's all the questions from us, Minister. If there's anything you want to say, please add it. But from my perspective, can I thank you and all your officials? I appreciate your officials are working extremely hard under difficult circumstances at the moment. So I think we, as a committee, all very much appreciate your work as well. Thank you, Minister, for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you. Thank you to you, Minister.
Thank you.
So we move to item 4 and under Standing Order 17.